I will always believe that I and many others in our nation.
Hello, everyone. You've been listening to Vice President Mike Pence deliver remarks in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Today is September 11th, 2019, a day of remembrance 18 years ago. Hijacked planes ramming into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a Shanksville field in Pennsylvania. So this was the deadliest terror attack on American soil that changed this country forever, taking nearly 3,000 lives. And today we remember because we will never forget. So our David Wright is right there at Ground Zero for the memorial. It's been going on all day. People remembering where they were and what happened during this time. So David, what's been going on this morning?
Well, here at Ground Zero, the ceremony itself was closed just to members of the families of the victims of the 9/11 attacks. But there was what's become really an annual ritual. Moments of silence followed by a reading of all the names, nearly 3,000 names, 2,600 people in those buildings, 250 people on the planes, 350 firefighters and first responders, and 60 police officers who died on 9/11. This has become an annual event, followed, of course, by moments of silence that are observed at the White House and at the Pentagon. President Trump attended the moment of silence at the White House and spoke at the Pentagon, talking about how the nation remembers and will never forget the grief that we suffered as a result of 9/11 and vowing vengeance. Interestingly, the president brought up the Taliban. Over the weekend, he had announced the news that he had scheduled a surprise peace summit with the Taliban at Camp David. He blamed them for canceling that summit and said that the U.S., if they ever come back to this country, he said today, the U.S. Will unleash military might like never seen before. I'm paraphrasing his words there, but it was harsh words for the Taliban. It's interesting, you know, this is a day that anybody who is old enough to remember will never forget. It's a dividing line between then and now. But for a generation of young people, this is something that they grew up in. It's interesting to think that all of the young people entering the military these days really are not old enough to remember 9/11. Some of them were even born after it.
Yeah, so David, have you...
And yet they're living with the... And yet they're living with the consequences of that day and still fighting the fight that began that day.
And David, have you talked to people right there in the area and seeing how people have felt? I know people are speaking, but what about the people that are observing it?
The people in the ceremony itself, we haven't been able to speak with. They're several blocks away here. But basically everybody downtown here remembers this day. And as you go around, you can see people are wearing, you know, a New York Yankees cap takes on a different significance on September 11th. And lots of people here with pride, patriotism, and somber remembrance are looking back on that day and paying their respects.
And David, of course, we're remembering the victims, but also the survivors. I just want you to tell us about the 9/11 Victims Act, the compensation fund made permanent earlier this year, a couple months back.
That's right, in part because of the advocacy of brave first responders, one of whom died just after that act was passed, after a powerful testimony on Capitol Hill, championed also by comedian Jon Stewart, who said that it's shameful that the U.S. Was close to defaulting on its promise to pay the medical bills of the first responders, many of whom have suffered years later and are still suffering, still being diagnosed in some cases with maladies that came as a result of their brave acts of heroism and intervention on that day. Now they can breathe easier, as it were, knowing that their medical bills and that their families will be cared for because Congress really was shamed into passing it.
All right, David Wright, right there at Ground Zero for us. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And like David said, if you were alive in 2001, old enough in 2001, you most likely remember where you were, what you were doing, what your family was doing on the morning of September 11th. Even if you weren't in New York City, I certainly do. I remember watching the terrifying images on the screen. But for our next guest, she lived it, a 12-year-old living 3 blocks away from the World Trade Center. Helena Regal, a 9/11 survivor and now a mental health advocate and author of the book you see there, After 9/11, One Girl's Journey Through Darkness to a New Beginning. So, Helena, I'm very, very happy that you're able to join us today. It's really nice to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I just want to start because it's obviously 18 years later. What does this day feel like for you?
Today is really a day where I reflect so much on how far we've come since that day happened. And for me personally, it's really about remembering the spirit of the day, where immediately afterwards there was this unity that we had in the community as we were affected down there just blocks away, where nothing mattered except looking out for each other and taking care of each other, because we were basically in a war zone. You know, there was no water, electricity, food coming into the area, people needed medications, and so families and other people became kind of first responders almost for each other, and you saw American flags everywhere, and it didn't matter, everyone was together. And I think that today, also importantly, yes, of course, it's very meaningful for survivors, but it's also a time to reflect on the people that we lost and that we're continuing to lose as well, unfortunately, due to these 9/11 related illnesses.
Absolutely. You were 12 years old at the time, which is mind-blowing because you're saying all of this, and to me, I feel like it would be hard to even process what was happening with it being so close to you.
Yeah, we were in middle school a couple blocks away, right next to Stuyvesant High School, and we didn't really know what was happening until we had, after the first plane hit, we were all in the cafeteria. It was chaos, and parents had started to rush in screaming and crying and pulling their kids out, and I just thought, what am I going to do? Because my parents didn't work downtown, and my grandparents lived in our apartment building, which was normally a 10-minute walk away across town, and I just thought, how am I going to get home to them? And my neighbor showed up in the doorway right when the bomb squad did and said, we have to get all these kids out in 5 minutes. And my neighbor and her son, who I walked to school with, said, we can take her. And we didn't know what was going to happen then when we left the school building.
Pretty scary.
It was, as soon as we opened the school doors, we looked up and we could just feel the heat of the fires. Both planes had hit at that point on our faces. Everyone was stopping and looking up. People were already being loaded into stretchers. It was just chaos. And the next hour we spent running for our lives, running from the dust cloud, being pulled into buildings, being covered, watching people bleeding and collapsing, just horrific, horrific things. But we still didn't know what was going on. To me, it felt like the world was ending. I thought bombs were being dropped on us, but we just thought, we have to get home, we have to get home. And it was terrifying because everyone was trying to get out. So we were rushing against crowds of people trying to get out, and the police wouldn't let us through. But finally, after an hour on our last hope, we did make it home.
Yeah, you wrote this, you wrote the book, obviously, and you also wrote an article where you say, I'll never forget what we saw, heard, smelled, and experienced as we were pushed through crowds of bloody, ash-covered bodies and a sea of police officers toward home. It seems like the world was ending, and although my parents and I had survived, the world as we knew it would not. Life after 9/11 was just the beginning. So what I want to ask you is about is the life after 9/11, the 6 months, the year after 9/11, how your entire world changed.
Absolutely. So there was definitely this spirit, immediately the next day with the elected officials telling everyone, let's get back to normal. We're not going to be changed. But in our home, in our neighborhood, it was a war zone. The National Guard was there with rifles. There was warnings of more attacks coming to like the Brooklyn Bridge, to City Hall, which were also blocks away. Every 5 seconds, they were telling us, I was throwing my stuff into the middle of the floor, like, we have to evacuate. They're going to get rid of us. Anytime we tried to walk outside, people were running and screaming that more buildings were coming down. And also there was this, so there were 2 weeks off of school as we were figuring out what to do about relocating. And during that time, what I now know was, there were very early symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, the crying, the nightmares, the ducking, and when I heard planes, the not wanting to separate from my parents for a second, the sleeplessness, the intrusive thoughts, and of course that fear that any second it could happen again. There was this feeling that when you're a child, if you're lucky, you grow up with the assumption that the world is a safe place and the adults are going to make sure you're okay. And now this was this was being thrown into, at age 12, a world where no one could keep you safe from anything. And so we were relocated. Our school was relocated to a building for a little further uptown that already had 3 schools inhabiting it. And I expected everyone to be super nice to each other and super kind, and that's not what happened. You had a bunch of us traumatized kids getting shoved around in the halls and kind of bullied, oh, you think you're special. And there was this one instance I'll never forget where we were all at recess and a truck tire popped outside, and you knew who was from our school, IS 89, because we all either like hit the floor or ran around and started crying and screaming, and all the other kids just laughed at us. So
what I want to ask you is, this is pretty traumatic. You're experiencing this, but how do you cope now? And at this point in your life, you're helping other people cope with traumas that they experience too, right?
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. It took a long time, unfortunately, to get the proper diagnosis. We knew that something was wrong, and I started trying to get help almost immediately, but I spent my teenage years not just going through the more complex symptoms of trauma, which can be difficulty in relationships, hyperemotionality, hyperarousal, insomnia, self-harm, addiction, these things that you might not necessarily think are linked to trauma, but when your brain pattern changes, right, when your response to the world is fight or flight, that applies to everything in your life, and that makes the stresses of a normal teenage adolescence and the angst that comes with it, it's like billows to the fire. And so I went to see psychiatrists and therapists, and I was told, I was given all these different diagnoses and medications that made me sick, but none of it quote unquote worked. And so that was almost re-traumatizing in itself, trying to get better and fix what was wrong with me and only getting worse. Eventually, I did finally find the right form of therapy when I got to college, which is CBT, which is what they give, war veterans. And it's that's when I started to really find recovery, and that turned into DBT, and that turned into 12-step recovery. I got sober when I was 22, and I had to basically relearn how to be in the world again and undo this kind of faulty wiring that had lodged itself into my brain.
Yeah. So your journey, people can read the entire journey and your experience in your book right here, After 9/11, One Girl's Journey Through Darkness to a New Beginning. We really appreciate you sharing your story,
Absolutely.
sharing it in the book, sharing it with us. Helena Hovitz-Riegel, thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Yes. So lots of people and President Trump marked the anniversary with a moment of silence and a ceremony at the Pentagon. So I want to bring in Karen Travers at the White House. Karen, good to see you. We know that Vice President Mike Pence was in Shanksville, and the president spoke at the Pentagon.
Yeah, there was a traditional moment of silence here this morning, or at 8:46, Kimberly. The president and the First Lady, as well as White House staff, gathering on the South Lawn. And then later the president went out to the Pentagon to participate in the observance ceremony there. The president's remarks were a combination of tribute to the heroes that day, the people who risked their own lives to save other lives. He also honored the memory of the victims of the terror attacks. But there was also a message of the aggressiveness of U.S. power, American military might. The president said that anybody who hits the United States will get hit back harder. It was striking, the president delivering those remarks, standing in front of the Pentagon, the symbol of the American military power, and just steps away from the spot that was hit by American Airlines Flight 77 on that morning 18 years ago.
Yes, Karen, very somber day, remembering 9/11. And as this is happening, there's also some turmoil in the White House. We know yesterday that John Bolton resigned.
This was just quite a surreal sequence of events, Kimberly. The White House announced a briefing with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Secretary of the Treasury Steve Mnuchin, and the National Security Advisor John Bolton. 62 minutes later, that's all it was, the president announced in a tweet that he had told John Bolton the night before that his services were no longer needed here in the administration. Bolton, very, very striking pushback, publicly saying he didn't get fired, he resigned, that he offered his resignation to the president Monday night and then offered it again yesterday morning, and the president accepted. So now the president with an acting national security advisor, and Bolton was the third person to serve in that position in less than 3 years.
Yeah, you just said that. So the third national security advisor, what does this mean going forward, and who do we know is going to be the replacement?
The president says he'll name a permanent replacement next week. But I think a big takeaway from all of this is that John Bolton and the president disagreed on several critical foreign policy issues: Iran, North Korea, and most recently that invitation the president was extending to the Taliban to come to Camp David and negotiate a peace agreement in Afghanistan. Bolton is said to be disagreeing with the president's push to do that, and the coverage of that in the last couple of days certainly not something the president liked to see. But that was one thing. The White House says there wasn't one thing that tipped the scales here, but certainly the president made it clear there were a lot of disagreements. Whoever he puts into this role in the permanent capacity, it's going to be interesting to see if they flex their muscles on security issues or foreign policy. Right now, Mike Pompeo is certainly the leading voice in the president's inner circle on all of these issues.
All right, Karen Travers at the White House with the updates. Thank you so much. We appreciate that. And guys, we're going to stay in politics, but we're going to move overseas to the UK, where there's more news concerning Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his actions in Parliament and whether they were lawful or not. So I am not going to pretend to fully understand. So I want to bring in James Longman in our London bureau. James, hi. Good to see you. I want you to treat me like a 5-year-old and break this down again for us.
Okay, Kimberly, so if you take nothing else away from what I'm about to tell you, understand this. For the first time, a UK court has found that a Prime Minister has misled the monarch. Basically, that Boris Johnson lied to the Queen. That is what a UK court said happened. They've agreed with the plaintiff. Now, this is obviously up for appeal. The government has said this isn't the case. But for the moment, as things stand today, that is what a UK court has found. And it is pretty extraordinary. We live in extraordinary times. Let's rewind a little bit to explain exactly how we came to this position. It's all around the suspension of Parliament. Now, it's called proroguing Parliament, and it's a kind of a normal part of our ceremonial life in this country. It's just really, it's a formality, really. And what happens is, basically, when a new government comes into power, they want to present their domestic agenda to the country, and it's done in the form of what's called a Queen's speech. That is the Queen getting up in front of Parliament in order to read out a speech, basically, that the government has written for her. In order for her to be able to do that, you need to suspend Parliament so that this ceremony can take place. And normally it only happens for maybe 5-6 days, maybe 2 weeks. This particular suspension was put in place by Boris Johnson for 5 weeks. Now, his critics will say, and in this case, the lawmakers who took this case to the court in Scotland, said, now, this 5-week period is unreasonable, and he did it because he wanted to make sure that lawmakers didn't have a chance to stop him from pushing the UK out of the European Union with a no-deal Brexit. Because remember, that deadline is October 31st. So by slapping this 5-week gap, this 5-week recess in, what he was doing was basically stopping them from getting in his way, going around the democratic process. And what happened today was that a UK court basically said, yes, we agree. We think that Boris Johnson did just that, and he lied to the Queen to get his prorogation. So it's pretty extraordinary. The next step is basically that there has been an appeal. Another court, by the way, in the United Kingdom did side with the government. So all of these court cases are going to be put into one next week at the UK Supreme Court. They are going to rule on this. But things are bubbling away in the meantime because his opposition, all those opposition lawmakers in Parliament, have seen their opportunity to say, well, look, the suspension no longer stands. Let's go and sit in Parliament. And as we speak, MPs on opposition benches are deciding whether or not they can stage, you know, a pretty visual kind of protest by going into the Houses of Parliament and sitting on those green benches. So, look, it is another chapter in a very, very complicated story, but it is a pretty big one, and we're all just enjoying the drama apart from anything else.
I appreciate that, and you just have to promise that as this proceeds, you're going to keep us updated, right?
I will try my hardest, Kimberly.
We appreciate it. James Longman in our London bureau, thank you so much. Good to see you. All right, so we're going to check back in on the 2020 race. You all know that the candidates are making their way down to Houston, and some of them just like us. Check out this tweet from Mayor Pete Buttigieg on his United flight. He was sitting right behind Senator Klobuchar. He said, very funny. Wonder what their conversation was about. And our our team has descended upon Houston, Texas for the third Democratic presidential debate because we are hosting it in partnership with Univision, and you see it there, drone shots of the city, and you'll also see the debate stage getting set up, time lapse there. So things are ramping up because tomorrow, for one night only, 10 candidates will make their bid to the American people, and our Adam Kelsey is right there in the debate hall. Adam, good to see you. What's happening right now? Tell us what's going on.
Good morning, Kimberly. Well, we're, like you said, inside the debate hall right behind me. I'm going to step out of the way so you can see this unbelievable stage that we've got set up. Some last-minute rehearsals, some blocking as our fantastic production crew gets ready for Thursday night. But as far as what's going on here in Houston, we're actually seeing a little bit less activity from the candidates than we saw during the first two rounds of debates. You may recall back in Miami for that first presidential debate, a number of the candidates were using it basically as a campaign stop. They went down to the Immigration Detention Center in Homestead to make the case that the immigration reform needs to take place. The Trump administration's policy of holding on to some of those folks, holding them criminally responsible for crossing the border, did not vibe basically with what the Democratic platform was. And then in Detroit for the second round of debates, some trips up to Flint, Michigan to call attention to the water crisis there, visits to neighborhoods that were affected by gentrification and other issues in Detroit as well. So less of the campaign stops, more of a kind of focused effort to prepare for this debate now that we're down to 10 candidates and some of those top tier names.
Yeah, and you've been traveling with Bernie Sanders, so do you know how he's like ramping up for the debate tomorrow?
Well, I think first and foremost, Bernie Sanders is taking a bit of a breather. It's been a busy past couple of days for him. He was in Manchester, New Hampshire for the New Hampshire Democratic Party convention on Saturday, went straight there to Iowa, made about 3 or 4 stops over the course of a day and a half, and then had a very large rally in Denver, Colorado. Not a typical early voting state, but it is show of force from the Sanders campaign. Brought out about 5,000 to 6,000 people in a park in Denver. Right now, like I said, taking a bit of a break. He sounded a little bit hoarse in Denver the other day and really preparing. He's going to be on that stage, like I said, with all of the top-tier candidates, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris. We haven't seen those big names all together on one stage yet. So for someone like Bernie Sanders, going back through his briefing materials, making sure that he's ready for some of the attacks that he might face as somebody who is on the liberal side of the political spectrum.
Yeah, this is going to be pretty exciting, and there are some new poll numbers showing where Trump stands against the other candidates.
Yeah, good numbers for Democrats released this morning. An ABC News Washington Post poll found that 5 Democratic candidates would beat President Trump in a nationwide head-to-head matchup. So, like I said, some of those names, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, all of them polling ahead of Donald Trump at this moment in time. And what the impact that these poll numbers is going to have on the race is that somebody like Joe Biden, who's been campaigning on a message of electability, may have to shift that message now. He's been saying that he is the sure bet for Democrats. He's the one who can go up against President Trump and beat him in November 2020. But now Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Kamala Harris, they can make the same case. They can point to those numbers right here on the debate stage on Thursday night and say, hey, we are just as likely to beat President Trump as you are. The numbers show it. So what else can you bring, Joe Biden? And that's going to be a question that he's going to have to answer during the debate.
All right, Adam Kelsey right there in Houston. And of course, everyone can watch the debate on ABC News Live. It airs tomorrow and starts at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So one thing that is sure to come up during this conversation is the economy. Politics, politicians and economists alike are debating tariffs and trade wars. But what about when we move from Wall Street to Main Street? Some of our ABC team got curious and checked out how the U.S. beef industry is holding up. So we met with one cattle ranch owner who is very careful when talking about the effect of tariffs on her business. From China to Japan, she's keeping a close eye on global trade. And our team in Houston took a trip to Crockett, Texas to learn more.
We know that we are actually producing the food that feeds all of our family and friends. So we take that very much to heart. We are a seed stock producer, so we are the ones that are producing the breeding animals for the Brangus and Ultra Black breed. We sell bulls and replacement females to other cow-calf producers in the United States, and we're focused on beef production. We don't use any type of ATVs to work the cattle. All the cattle are gathered by horseback and brought into the pens. My day-to-day really is focused primarily on business operations. My father's co-owner with me, and that's where my strength lies. Our impact is so much more global than it ever was. China, you know, everybody, that's the hot button topic right now is China. Japan, we're established. There is a huge demand for our beef. That's why it's so important for that trade agreement to be done. China, on the other hand, hasn't really had access to high quality U.S. beef in the past. And so their culture is not very beef centric. It's becoming that. It is more of a long-term type of goal that U.S. beef producers have. This industry is not easy. It's a definitely low-margin industry from that standpoint, but we do it because we love it. Actually providing food and nutrition to the families all around the world.
All right, so that trade war is impacting everyone. And again, the candidates will probably be discussing this, the top contenders, as well as some underdogs on the stage, like Andrew Yang. His most popular policy, the Freedom Dividend, which is a universal basic income of $1,000 for American adults with no strings attached. Well, if you ever wondered what this program would even look like, Stockton, California is giving it a shot, launching a program that guarantees $500 to adults for 18 months. It's called the SEED program, or Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration. And yesterday, I talked to the director, Suki Samara, and Zane, one of the first 100 recipients. So take a look. Really glad you guys are with us today, because this SEED program is the country's first ever city-led guaranteed income initiative. So Suki, I want to start with you. If you can just tell us why and how this SEED program was created.
Sure, and thank you so much for having us. As you said, SEED is the nation's first mayor-led guaranteed income demonstration. We're giving 125 Stocktonians a guaranteed income of $500 a month. We began in February of 2019. We really believe that Stockton is an all-American city. We're a microcosm of America. Diversity is our greatest asset, but we're also an all-American city in terms of our problems. We were a city that was hit hard by the 2009 recession, and we're still struggling to recover. 1 in 4 of our folks live in poverty. We're 18th in the nation for child poverty, and our city's median household income falls far below that of the state. And so we knew that the status quo is just untenable, and that we needed to take bold steps to prove to policymakers and to the nation alike that the current economy just isn't working for everyone. And that's why we launched SEED.
And where does the money come from? Because I think that's a question a lot of people have.
Yeah, so all of the money for SEED comes from philanthropic sources. We're fully philanthropically funded. No taxpayer dollars are being used to support the demonstration. We started with an initial $1 million donation from the Economic Security Project and have been supported by a number of other philanthropic organizations since then.
And Zane, you were one of the recipients. You've been, it's been about 7 months since it started. So how has this program changed your life, this extra $500 every month?
Well, it came at a time where I was unemployed, and my husband and I was pretty much drowning. So I was the breadwinner, and far as him being a contract truck driver, if he missed a day, he didn't get paid. So now that, we have this extra income, it kind of supplemented if he missed a day, and we automatically set up that $500. Of course, I take out my tithes. That's mandatory. So I get it as $450. And, our direct TV and our electricity bill and car insurance, that's automatic to where we don't have to stress off of that. And then, we have our little date nights or whatever. So it works out. Yeah.
What was it like when you learned that you were going to be one of the recipients?
I said, shut the front door. I was like, no. I was like, wait a minute. We have close to 300,000 people in this city. And I'm the type of person, I'm nosy, so I read everything that comes in my mail. So it doesn't look like, hey, you're going to get some money. It's something that you would have to actually read your mail. And randomly picked, that's that's only God. That's a blessing.
That's amazing. So it's clearly making a difference. Suki, I want to ask you what happens beyond the 18 months, because right now that's when it ends. Yes.
Yeah, so we are an 18-month program, time-limited intervention. For us, the goal is really twofold. It's to produce data and stories that advocate and push the case for guaranteed income on a statewide or national level. It's exciting that before the demonstration's even over, we're seeing momentum amongst policymakers, whether it's the expansion of the EITC like we did here in California, or it's Senator Harris's Lift the Middle Class Act, or Representative Rashida Tlaib's Boost Act. We're really seeing this push to really codify an income floor as part of the social contract. And we hope that as the demonstration continues, the data and the stories coming out will just prove the case further that a guaranteed income or some iteration of it should be scaled.
All right, Suki, good work. And Zane, so nice to meet you and see that it's having a positive impact in your life. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Amazing program. So again, our entire team is in Houston, and you can actually check out the briefing room that's going to be live at the debate hall in Houston at 3:30 p.m. And right now we're going to leave you with some pictures from the 9/11 ceremony today. Take care.